Designing crewed spacecraft is a very difficult process. There are a lot of very minor things that need to be taken care of, and even then, there is no guarantee that you're going to succeed. That is what this series is about. I want to talk about designing spacecraft for the pilots who fly them. Now, I'm not an engineer, and I'm no expert at all in this, so I'm going to be citing a lot of my sources down in the description and basing a lot of my beliefs based off of historical spacecraft and expert opinions. So, before we get started, let's get some historical context about who the first cosmonauts and astronauts were and why they were selected.
Exploration is a dangerous career. Whether it is climbing mountains, diving depths, or flying into space, boldly going where no one has gone before comes with no guarantee that you will return from that unknown. The earliest explorers were often ill-prepared for the dangers of the unknowns that they explored, and even when they were, not many knew how to handle the stress of the incredible tasks they dared to perform. This posed an incredible amount of risk to themselves, their crew, their equipment, and the mission's success. As a result, not only did the first space explorers need to be able to take control of high-speed, extraordinarily complex, and incredibly dangerous test vehicles, but they needed to be able to represent the best of us. Test pilots were a natural choice. Because of their experience handling complex, untested aircraft in extreme environments, and many had already become famous public figures for their accomplishments as test pilots. On April 9, 1959, NASA announced the first class of astronauts. They were known as the Mercury 7. 6 of these astronauts would fly into space. These astronauts were Scott Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, John Glenn, Virgil Gus Grissom, Walter Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and who would not fly until Apollo, Donald Deke Slayton. The Soviet Union chose 20 initial cosmonauts, and on their first Vostok flights, 6 cosmonauts would fly. They were Yuri Gagarin, German Titov, Andriy Nikolaev, Pavel Popovich, Valery Bykovsky, and Valentina Tereshkova.
It was not all that long ago that we made our first steps into space. In fact, the time between the Wright brothers' first powered flight and the Apollo 11 moon landing is around the same amount of time as the Apollo 11 moon landing and today. It took 66 years from the powered flight to land on the moon, and it has been a little over 50 years to today. Looking over how both the Soviet Union and NASA had developed their early spacecraft in competition with each other is a great way to look at how different spacecraft can be designed and used in different ways.
The first crewed spacecraft were not very capable. They could get into space, point themselves in the direction they needed to point, and then return to land back on Earth while carrying their crew members. Independently and at the same time, NASA and the Soviet Union developed the Vostok and Mercury capsules, which were designed for the same missions of proving a human can survive in space, control a spacecraft, eat, sleep, and perform any other tasks needed in the weightless environment. Vostok, meaning east in Russian, was not only the Soviet Union's first crewed vehicle to fly into space, but is also the first crewed spacecraft to ever fly. It was made up of 2 major sections: the spherical descent module, the crew sat there from launch to reentry, and the instrument module carrying scientific experiments, the orientation engines, and the retrograde engine. The spacecraft would double as an uncrewed spy satellite, and the cosmonauts who flew it had little input in the design and up to no control of the spacecraft in flight. The Mercury capsule was remarkably like the Vostok in mission, but was completely different in its form. The capsule had a conical shape in contrast with the spherical shape of the Vostok. Mercury had access to miniaturized technology developed by the United States, allowing the spacecraft to be smaller and lighter. The astronauts were much more involved in the development of the spacecraft. Unlike the Soviet Union's cosmonauts, NASA astronauts could take over control of the spacecraft and orient it at any time after launch vehicle separation. After completing the final flights of Mercury and Vostok, both space programs developed in-between projects to help them better develop their lunar spacecraft. NASA started this in-between period with the Gemini spacecraft, an ambitious program designed to test and prove that all the necessary parts of the Apollo program could be completed. The Soviet Union developed the Voskhod program, which taught the Soviet Union how to fly multiple crew members and how to perform EVAs. Voskhod, meaning rising sun in Russian, was refurbished Vostok hardware. The Soviet space program took 2 Vostok spacecraft, modified one to carry 3 cosmonauts into orbit in order to prepare for the necessary multi-crew flights of Soyuz, and then modified the second one to carry 2 seats and an inflatable airlock in order to perform the first EVA. Gemini was very much like Mercury in its design, although it could carry 2 astronauts and used a service module with orientation and translation engines, giving it the ability to not only perform rendezvous maneuvers but also dock in space. The spacecraft and program taught NASA how to fly multiple crew members, how to rendezvous and dock, how to live in space long term, and how to EVA.
After Voskhod and Gemini came the respective lunar programs from both the Soviet Union and the United States. While only the United States would land on the moon, both programs would prove useful in multiple mission types and would eventually meet up in space during the Apollo-Soyuz test project.
The Soyuz was the main spacecraft designed by the Soviet Union meant to take their cosmonauts to the moon and return them safely to Earth. Its major components were the instrument module, the reentry module, and the orbit module. Soyuz, meaning Union in Russian, originally referenced the union of the 3 spacecraft, but would eventually mean much more, as it not only participated in the Apollo-Soyuz test project, but also, with its incredibly long history, lasting until the modern day, participated in the Shuttle Mir project, and is participating in the International Space Station program. It was paired with the Lunar Korabil, or lunar craft, for flights to the moon. But due to failures of the N-1, it never flew on this sort of flight. Instead, it would be used to transport cosmonauts to the Salyut, Mir, and International Space Stations. The Apollo Command and Service Module, or CSM, was the major spacecraft of the Apollo lunar program. It consisted of the familiar Apollo capsule, where the astronauts lived, worked, and returned to Earth, and the service module, which provided propulsion, orientation, translation controls, as well as water, oxygen, and electricity for the bulk of the flight up until re-entry. Apollo would house 3 astronauts for the trip to the moon, where 2 would land on the surface and return with the aid of the lunar module. Later, as lunar flights were canceled, the Apollo spacecraft would fly to the Skylab space station and then to dock with the Soyuz during the Apollo-Soyuz test project. It was eventually replaced with the more capable and much larger Space Shuttle for continued American crewed flights into space.
By looking to these spacecraft, we can see the different ways that engineers of the past had solved the problems that engineers of the present face when designing spacecraft. While spacecraft designs have changed drastically in the recent future, some of the concepts remain the same. One of those constants is control, the ability to control your spacecraft while in space. There are 2 categories of control for a spacecraft. There is orientation, or things such as yaw, pitch, and roll. And there is translation controls, the ability to translate your spacecraft laterally in space. Now, the only system that provides a total control of all axes of control in both orientation and translation is reaction control systems, or RCS. These are small rocket engines that are placed along the side of a rocket or a spacecraft that provides they fire in a sequence that allows them to control the specific orientation or translation controls that they need to control. These are often powered by monopropellants run over a reactive catalyst inside of an ignition or pressure chamber, or a supercooled gas run through a nozzle, or even a bipropellant that is powered by hypergolic propellants. This does come with added mass of the fuel, but the multi-use capabilities of this system pretty much negates the added mass of the fuel.
Vostok and Voskhod used cold gas thruster reaction control systems. These were positioned near the rear of the spacecraft and were only capable of orienting the spacecraft. In early flights of Vostok, there were no thrusters for roll, as it was deemed unnecessary. The Mercury capsule required the same level of control as Vostok and Voskhod. It used hydrogen peroxide thrusters for its orientation. They were positioned in the nose of the spacecraft and would allow automatic control system and the astronaut to control the spacecraft's pitch, yaw, and roll at any point in the flight after the launch vehicle separated. Because of the capsule's conical design, it required a greater degree of control during re-entry, which is why the RCS is positioned in the nose, so it would be used during re-entry to keep the spacecraft pointed heat shield first. Gemini required a greater degree of control than Mercury, Vostok, and Voskhod, as it needed to be able to rendezvous and dock while in orbit. As a result, Gemini had 3 separate rings of RCS, all powered by hypergolic fuels. In the service module was 2 rings, the orientation ring and the translation ring. The translation ring was positioned along the center of mass of the spacecraft while in flight. The orientation controls broke up into 2 separate stages of flight. While in orbit, the orientation thrusters in the service module were used to control the craft. After service module separation, the reentry control system in the nose of the spacecraft would take over. The Soyuz, like the Gemini, required translation and rotational thrusters to be able to rendezvous and dock. Making things even more difficult, the solar panels that provided electrical power to the vehicle cannot be fired through. This required that the RCS nozzles of the Soyuz be split into aft and forward sections, with the forward sections firing through the center of mass of the spacecraft to provide rotation, translation, and backwards thrust, and the aft providing some rotation and forward thrust to the vehicle. The Apollo Command and Service module, just like the Soyuz, needed to be able to rendezvous and dock. To do this, it used a series of RCS quads, powered by hypergolic propellants. A much more iconic RCS configuration. These are positioned in the service module, around the center of mass. This configuration allows the vehicle to use the same quads for orientation and translation.
The next system that is often used is our gyroscopic control systems and reaction wheels. Every Kerbal Space Program player will often gravitate towards these options. After all, they do not require fuel, they just use electric charge, and they work very well in KSP. While KSP describes these parts all as reaction wheels and just uses them to point the spacecraft, there are many types that I can't possibly do justice, so linked in the description is a Scott Manley video that does so much better.
Taking what we have learned from the spacecraft in the past, I have begun the process of designing a spacecraft for KSP and a real-life one modeled using Simple Rockets 2 with the Real Solar Systems mod installed. Most of the controls I chose for this vehicle is a reaction control system, with a series of small reaction wheels positioned as a backup in case of RCS failure or we run out of RCS fuel.
Thank you all so much for watching. Check out the links down below to learn more. Let me know what you think in the comments, give it a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you want to see more. And always remember, keep looking up.